My parents erased me for 3 years, acting like I was dead. Then they invaded my private yacht. Moments later, Dad demanded, "Give me the company ledger. Your brother needs a bailout." There is a specific kind of silence that you can only buy when you are miles away from the shoreline, floating on millions of dollars of meticulously engineered fiberglass and steel. I was 28 years old, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I felt like I could finally exhale. I was sitting on the aft deck of my yacht, the Sovereign, letting the heavy, humid Miami heat wash over me. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. I had a glass of 20-year-old scotch resting on the side table next to me, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the ocean against the hull. It was peaceful. It was mine. I had built a logistics and maritime salvage company from absolutely nothing, turning a single, rusting tugboat into a fleet that commanded respect across the eastern seaboard. This yacht was my sanctuary, the one place where the noise of the world, and more importantly, the noise of my past, could not reach me. Or so I thought. The illusion of safety shattered when I heard the heavy thud of footsteps rushing up the teak stairs. It wasn't the confident, measured stride of my captain, nor the light, professional step of the stewardess. It was a panicked, clumsy sound. I turned my head and saw Finn. He was my 19-year-old junior deckhand, a kid fresh out of high school who usually walked around with a bright, eager smile, always trying to impress the senior crew. But right now, Finn looked like he was walking to the gallows. He was standing by the gangway, wringing his white uniform cap in his hands so hard his knuckles were turning pale. His face was completely drained of color, and his eyes were darting everywhere except toward me. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. When you run a business like mine, a look like that on an employee's face usually means something is sinking, someone is bleeding, or a massive contract just went up in smoke. I sat up straighter, setting my glass down. I asked him what was wrong, keeping my voice as calm and level as possible. Finn stammered, his voice cracking. He apologized profusely, practically begging for my forgiveness before he even explained the situation. He told me that people had boarded the vessel. He said they had identification. They told him it was a highly classified, surprise anniversary visit, and that if he ruined the surprise by radioing me, the man claiming to be my father would ensure I fired him on the spot. My blood ran cold. The knot in my stomach turned into a block of solid ice. They didn't pick a lock to get onto my multi-million-dollar yacht. They didn't hack a security keypad or bypass the marina's gated entry. They had simply bullied a terrified teenager. That was their specialty. It was social engineering weaponized through pure, unadulterated entitlement. They knew exactly which pressure points to squeeze on a kid who was desperate to keep his first real job. I didn't need to ask for names. I knew exactly who was standing inside my main salon. I took a deep breath, fighting the sudden tremor in my hands. I looked at Finn, who was still shaking, waiting for me to explode. But I didn't. I told him it was fine, that he hadn't done anything wrong, and that he should go down to the crew mess and take his break. I told him I would handle the garbage. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my linen trousers. I hadn't seen my parents in 3 years. 3 years of complete, absolute radio silence. No phone calls, no holiday cards, no awkward birthday texts. It had been a clean, silent break. But they hadn't come out of the blue to reconcile. People like them don't do apologies. I knew, with absolute certainty, that they had come to collect. I walked through the sliding glass doors and into the main salon. The invasion was total, absolute, and suffocating. For oversized, scuffed suitcases were dumped carelessly in the middle of the walkway, blocking the path to the dining area. The pristine, temperature-controlled air of the cabin now smelled faintly of stale airport coffee and cheap cologne. And there they were, the ghosts of my past, breathing my air, standing on my teak floors. My brother, Declan, was already sprawling comfortably on my custom Italian leather sofa. He didn't even bother to take his shoes off. He was 31 years old, dressed in designer clothes he definitely couldn't afford, scrolling mindlessly through his phone as if he were waiting in a hotel lobby. He looked up at me, gave a lazy, entitled smirk, and casually gestured around the room. He had the nerve to tell me the place wasn't bad, though a little sterile for his taste, but he figured he could work with it. Then he complained about the internet speed. I stared at him, my vision tunneling. I told him to get out. All of them. Instantly. Before the words fully left my mouth, my mother, Beatrice, walked out of the hallway leading to my private master suite. She was casually wiping her hands on a monogrammed towel she had pulled right out of my private bathroom cabinet. But that wasn't the worst part. I watched in horrified fascination as she dug her fingers into a glass jar resting on the counter. It was my $800 custom face cream. She scooped out a massive, thick glob of the expensive serum and carelessly slapped it onto her cracked heel, rubbing it in without even looking up at me. She sighed, telling me not to be so dramatic, adding that my behavior was unbecoming for family. She told me I had plenty of room on this boat. Then, the final piece of the nightmare stepped out from behind the wet bar. My father, Harrison. He was holding a crystal tumbler, having already poured himself a generous measure of my vintage, top-shelf scotch. He stood there, looking around my yacht not with the pride of a father seeing his daughter's success, but with the calculating eye of an auditor assessing inventory. I stepped between them, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I clearly stated that they were trespassing on a commercially registered vessel, and if they were not off my boat in 5 minutes, I would have the Port Authority drag them off in handcuffs. Harrison just laughed. It was a dry, mocking sound. He took a sip of my scotch, the heavy scent of the alcohol rolling off his breath as he took a step closer, intentionally invading my personal space. He asked me what I was going to tell the police. That I was evicting my poor, elderly parents after everything they had done for me? He looked me dead in the eye and delivered the first blow. He stated, with absolute, terrifying calmness, that I needed to pack my things and move down to the crew quarters immediately. He said that Declan was going through a stressful time and needed my master suite to heal and recover. My own father was standing in the middle of everything I had bled to build, looking me in the eye and ordering me to sleep with my employees so his 31-year-old failure of a son could rest his head on my silk pillowcases. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at them, realizing that the 3 years of distance hadn't changed a single thing. They still looked at me and saw nothing but a resource to be consumed. But the master suite was just the opening negotiation. A distraction. The real motive surfaced seconds later. I crossed my arms, digging my fingernails into my palms to keep from striking my father. I told him I wasn't moving anywhere and that Declan could heal on a park bench for all I cared. Harrison's mocking smile vanished, replaced by a hardened, ruthless glare. The mask of the visiting father completely fell away. He set the crystal tumbler down on the bar with a sharp clack. He didn't ask, he commanded. He told me to stop playing games and go fetch my laptop. He demanded I open the company ledger and hand over the bank codes. Right now. He spoke to me like I was a disobedient middle management employee who had failed to submit a weekly report. He told me Declan was in trouble. Serious, life-altering trouble. Beatrice chimed in from the sofa, still rubbing my expensive cream into her feet. She complained that they had to move out of their house that morning to hide from the people Declan owed money to. She pointed a finger at me, her voice rising in shrill indignation, stating that since I was the only one in the family sitting on a pile of gold that I obviously didn't need, I was going to fix it. I looked at Declan. He had finally stopped scrolling on his phone. His face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. For a split second, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in his eyes. It was the only honest emotion currently present in the room. Harrison dropped the number like he was reading the morning weather forecast. $148,000. Declan had borrowed it against some idiotic crypto venture that went completely belly up, and the lender wasn't a friendly neighborhood bank. It was a private, highly aggressive lender who didn't send polite past-due notices in the mail. They sent photos of Declan walking to his car in the dark. Harrison looked at me, expecting me to simply nod, pull out my phone, and transfer the wealth I had sacrificed my youth to build. I let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. I told them they were completely out of their minds. I explained the basic reality of running a maritime logistics company. I told them I did not have 150 grand in cold, hard cash just sitting in a desk drawer waiting for a rainy day. I explained that my capital was heavily tied up in commercial marine fuel, liability insurance, payroll, and constant vessel maintenance. Liquidating that much operating cash on a random Tuesday afternoon without warning would severely cripple my supply chain and put my own contracts at risk. Beatrice stood up, walking over to the bar to pour herself a glass of sparkling water, entirely unbothered by my explanation. She waved her hand dismissively, telling me to just liquidate it anyway. She looked at me with cold, dead eyes and said that I was smart. I could easily rebuild my cash flow. But Declan didn't have that luxury. She asked me, her voice dripping with venomous guilt, if I was really going to value a corporate bank balance over my own brother's physical safety. I stared at the three of them, the sheer weight of their delusion pressing down on my chest. They weren't asking for a favor. They were executing a hostile takeover of my life. I looked at my father, the man who was supposed to protect me when I was a child, and asked him a very simple question. I asked him why Declan's gambling debt was suddenly my financial responsibility. I asked why I was expected to be the default insurance policy for a grown man's endless string of failures. Harrison sighed heavily. It was that specific, patronizing sound he always made, the sound of a patient, long-suffering teacher having to explain a very simple concept to a remarkably slow student. He leaned against the bar, swirling the remaining amber liquid in his glass. He told me I was looking at this all wrong. He said it wasn't charity. He told me to think of it as a retroactive repayment. The phrase hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Retroactive repayment. Harrison began to list his grievances. He reminded me that after I graduated college, I had lived in my childhood bedroom for one single month while I searched for my first job. He emphasized that they had graciously put a roof over my head for 18 years. They had fed me. They had housed me. They had supported me when I was absolutely nothing. He then took it a step further, wandering into the darkest corners of a narcissist's twisted mathematics. He claimed he had run the numbers. He had factored in inflation, the compound interest of child-rearing, and the opportunity cost of spending money on my existence instead of investing it in the stock market. According to his deranged mental ledger, I owed the family roughly $150,000 anyway. He looked at me with a completely straight face and said they were simply calling the note due. He waved his hand dismissively at the million-dollar interior of the yacht, the polished wood, the luxury fittings. He asked me if I seriously thought this success belonged solely to me. In his mind, it didn't. It was theirs. They had invested basic biological necessities into keeping me alive, and now, when the family needed a return on that investment, I was being ugly, selfish, and greedy by trying to hoard my hard-earned wealth for myself. I stood there, feeling the air leave the room. They had literally monetized my existence. Every plate of cheap spaghetti, every night spent sleeping under their roof, every bare minimum moment of legally required parenting had been logged in a mental spreadsheet. It had been accruing interest in their minds for almost 3 decades, just waiting for the exact moment I had enough liquidity to be harvested. The rules of their universe were simple and incredibly cruel. My hard work, my risk, my sleepless nights building a company from the brink of bankruptcy, that was just family equity finally maturing. My assets were considered public domain for the family's use. But Declan? Declan's failures were a collective tragedy. His bad debts were a family emergency that required an immediate, unquestioned bailout. I looked at my father and told him, my voice low and trembling with suppressed rage, that he never invested in me. I told him that I survived him, and he survived me, and that was the end of our transaction. As I stared into Harrison's demanding eyes, the polished interior of the yacht seemed to fade away. The smell of expensive leather and sea salt vanished, replaced by the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned scent of a local bank branch. I was suddenly 21 years old again. It was a rerun of a nightmare from 7 years ago, playing out in vivid detail in my mind. My grandmother, the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw a person instead of an obligation, had passed away. When the will was read, She had left me $10,000. To people like my parents, 10 grand was weekend money. But to me, a broke college grad with giant dreams of the maritime industry, it was everything. It was my seed money. It was my literal escape fund to finally get out from under their suffocating roof. I remember the sheer hope I felt walking into the bank the day after her funeral, planning to transfer the funds into a secure, private account. I remember sitting in the uncomfortable fabric chair across from the bank teller. I remember the confused, pitying look on her face when she typed my account number into her computer. She turned the monitor toward me and told me the account was completely empty. $0.00. I thought there had been a massive clerical error. My heart hammered in my chest as the teller printed out the recent withdrawal slip and slid it across the desk. I stared at the piece of paper until my vision blurred. The signature on the bottom line was supposed to be mine. But the curve of the letters, the specific, shaky loop of the first initial, it was a dead giveaway. It was exactly the way my father, Harrison, wrote when he was nervous or rushing. My own parents had walked into my bank, forged my signature, and completely drained my inheritance. When I drove home that day, screaming and crying, confronting them in the living room, they didn't even have the decency to deny it. They didn't look ashamed. They looked annoyed. They sat me down and told me I was being incredibly selfish and short-sighted. They explained that Declan had a brilliant vision for a new tech app, and he needed the capital immediately to secure developers. They looked at my dreams of starting a logistics business and told me that I just had a cute little hobby, but Declan was building a real future. They sacrificed my only lifeline to fund his delusion. That was the day I packed a single duffel bag and walked out of their house, disappearing from their lives. The girl they had robbed that day died the moment she saw that empty bank account. She was replaced by something much colder and much harder. Standing in my yacht, looking at the family that had cannibalized my starting line, the memories of the 3 years of radio silence flooded back. They thought I had just vanished into thin air and magically reappeared as a wealthy CEO. They had absolutely no idea about the blood, the grease, and the silence. After they stole my $10,000, I didn't have the luxury of mourning. I had to rebuild from absolute zero. While Declan was using my dead grandmother's money to post photos of VIP bottle service in Las Vegas clubs, playing the role of a successful tech founder, I was sleeping in a damp, moldy room above a bait shop. I took a job as a deckhand on a commercial salvage tugboat. For years, I scrubbed rust-off metal decks until the skin on my hands literally cracked and bled into the soapy water. I smelled constantly of diesel exhaust and cheap instant ramen. I worked back-to-back 36-hour shifts, pulling drowning vessels out of storms, saving every single dollar of hazard pay and every tiny tip I could scrape together. I didn't go out. I didn't buy clothes. I didn't have a life. I studied maritime law at night under a flickering bulb, learning how to buy distressed vessels at auction for pennies on the dollar. I fought through panic attacks alone in the dark, terrified that I would fail and end up crawling back to the people who broke me. The isolation was brutal, but it forged me into iron. I learned how to negotiate with ruthless shipyard bosses, how to read contracts, and how to spot a bad deal from a mile away. Over those 3 years of silence, I bought my first tugboat, then a barge, then a small shipping fleet. I built my empire on top of the trauma they handed me. They didn't just neglect me as a daughter, they had actively tried to consume me so their golden child could thrive. They ate my start, and now, standing here in the air-conditioned luxury of the life I built with my own bleeding hands, they were demanding to eat my finish. I looked at Harrison, Beatrice, and Declan. They were looking right back at me, seeing only a bank account. They thought I was still the terrified 21-year-old girl who would eventually cry and submit to family pressure. They didn't realize that the woman standing on this deck wasn't a daughter anymore. She was a CEO. And a CEO knows exactly how to deal with a hostile takeover. The anger inside me suddenly crystallized into pure, freezing focus. I wasn't going to fight them. Fighting gave them leverage, it made them feel like they were my equals. No, I needed to act like an investor. I needed to let them think they had one. Before we find out how I deal with this hostile family takeover, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below with the name of the city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push this video to a wider audience, and I truly appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to the story. I stood there in the main salon of my yacht, looking at the three people who shared my blood but had absolutely no concept of my soul. Declan was sweating, waiting for me to save him. Beatrice was annoyed that I was taking so long to comply. Harrison was radiating smug authority, fully believing he had just successfully bullied his runaway daughter into submission. A younger version of me, the 21-year-old girl who had cried in the bank parking lot, would have screamed at them. She would have thrown glasses, hurled insults, and eventually broken down in tears before calling harbor security to drag them away kicking and screaming. But that girl was gone. Screaming meant I cared. Fighting meant I still saw them as family, as equals whose opinions somehow mattered to my emotional state. I didn't care anymore. I looked at Harrison, and the anger inside me suddenly went completely cold and silent. I realized that arguing with a narcissist is like trying to put out a grease fire with a glass of water. It only makes the flames spread faster. I needed to lock my emotions in a vault and put on the only armor that worked against people like them. I needed to become the chief executive officer. I let out a long, heavy sigh, letting my shoulders drop just a fraction of an inch to signal defeat. I looked at the floor, then back up at Harrison, making sure my eyes looked tired and resigned. I told him that fine, he won. I said I would pay the debt. I watched as the tension immediately drained from Declan's face. He actually slumped back against the Italian leather sofa, letting out a massive breath of relief. Beatrice didn't even look up from her phone, simply murmuring that it was about time I remembered where I came from. Harrison smirked, that awful, self-satisfied smile of a man who thinks he is the smartest person in the room. He told me to just log into my banking app and wire the money to the account number on the demand letter. But I shook my head, keeping my voice incredibly steady and professional. I explained that it wasn't that simple. I told them that liquidating $148,000 in a single, unscheduled transaction from a corporate maritime account would instantly trigger a massive fraud alert if I tried to do it from a mobile app over a Marina Wi-Fi network. I lied smoothly, explaining that the bank's security protocols for corporate accounts over a certain threshold required in-person verification for spontaneous wire transfers to private, unregistered entities. I told Harrison that if I tried to do it from my phone right now, the bank would freeze my entire operating account pending a federal investigation, and Declan's lender wouldn't get a single dime for at least 30 days. Harrison narrowed his eyes, swirling the scotch in his glass. He was suspicious, but his greed was stronger than his intuition. He didn't understand corporate banking, and my explanation was just technical enough to sound entirely plausible. He asked me if I was planning on running to the police, warning me that involving the cops would end very badly for his precious son. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and looked him dead in the eye. I told him I wasn't going to the cops. I told him I was going to the bank to save his son, just like I always ended up paying for everyone's mistakes. I turned my back on them and walked out of the salon, down the teak stairs and off the yacht. I didn't look back. I knew exactly what they were doing the moment I stepped onto the dock. They were pouring another round of my expensive liquor, celebrating their victory, completely unaware that I wasn't heading to a bank to surrender. I was going to war. I didn't drive toward the financial district. Instead, I pointed my car toward Little Havana. The drive took about 25 minutes, giving me plenty of time to let the cold reality of the situation settle into my bones. The Miami heat shimmered off the asphalt, but inside the air-conditioned cabin of my car, my mind was racing through contract law, liability clauses, and asset acquisition strategies. I pulled up to a discreet, dimly lit cigar bar tucked away on a side street. It was the kind of place that didn't have a sign out front, a place that smelled permanently of aged cedar, rich tobacco, and old, dangerous money. I walked past the heavy velvet curtains at the entrance and headed straight for a large leather booth in the very back corner. Sitting there, nursing a tiny cup of jet black espresso, was Aunt Clara. Clara was technically my mother's older sister, but biologically, they might as well have been different species. Clara was a retired corporate litigator who had spent 35 years destroying opposing counsel in high-stakes mergers and acquisitions. She was 65 years old, wore impeccably tailored suits, had divorced 3 very wealthy husbands, and had legally managed to keep every single one of their houses. She was terrifying, brilliant, and the only person in my bloodline who had ever looked at me with an ounce of respect. During those 3 years of silence, Clara was the only family member I stayed in contact with. She had quietly mentored me, teaching me the brutal realities of business law over expensive dinners she insisted on paying for. I slid into the booth across from her. She didn't offer a hug or a warm greeting. She just looked at my face, read the absolute murder in my eyes, and extended a hand that glittered with several very expensive diamonds. She simply said, "Show me the paper." I reached into my bag and pulled out the crumpled demand letter that Declan had left on my kitchen counter. I had snagged it on my way out. I smoothed it out on the dark wood table and slid it over to her. Clara pulled a pair of tortoiseshell reading glasses from her pocket and perched them on her nose. She scanned the document in silence for about 30 seconds. The bar was quiet, just the low hum of jazz and the clinking of glasses. Then, Clara let out a dry, sharp bark of laughter. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the letterhead. She looked at me and said that my brother had truly outdone himself this time. She read the name of the holding company at the top of the page. Apex Global Holdings. She took off her glasses and leaned in. She told me this wasn't just some random loan shark operating out of a local dive bar. This was Trenton Graves. Clara explained that Trenton ran a highly aggressive, predatory lending shell company out of a rundown strip mall in Fort Lauderdale. His entire business model was built on finding the weak, desperate, and incredibly stupid children of wealthy families, giving them massive amounts of cash for idiotic ventures, and then terrifying them into paying double or triple the interest rate under the threat of physical violence or public ruin. Clara knew him. She knew exactly how he operated. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. I asked her if we could stall him. I asked if there was a legal injunction we could file to freeze the collection efforts while I figured out how to get my family off my boat without Declan ending up in a hospital. Clara took a slow sip of her espresso, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. She set the cup down and smiled. It was a smile that had undoubtedly made grown men cry in deposition rooms. She told me we weren't going to stall him. She said we were going to do something much, much better. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She told me that Trenton Graves was a parasite, but he was a parasite who owed her a massive, career-saving favor from a corporate merger back in 1998. She looked at the demand letter again, then looked at me, outlining a plan that was so ruthless, so perfectly legal, and so incredibly vindictive that I felt a genuine shiver go down my spine. Clara didn't waste a single second. She explained the mechanics of the trap with the precision of a surgeon. She told me that Trenton Graves knew my brother Declan was a massive default risk. Men like Declan never actually paid their debts. They just hid behind their families until someone else wrote the check. Trenton was currently holding a piece of paper that said Declan owed him $148,000, but Trenton also knew that collecting the full amount would require time, intimidation, and potentially messy legal fees. Clara looked at me and said that if she called Trenton right now and offered him 60 cents on the dollar in straight, untraceable cash wired to his holding account today, he would sell the debt note to us just to get the liability off his books. He would much rather have a guaranteed $88,800 in his pocket by dinner time than spend 6 months chasing my pathetic brother for the full amount. I didn't even hesitate. I opened my iPad, logged into my secure corporate banking portal, and told Clara to make the call. I watched as my aunt dialed the number. When the line connected, her voice completely transformed. It dropped into a terrifyingly pleasant, razor-sharp register. She greeted Trenton like an old friend, smoothly navigating through 5 seconds of small talk before dropping the hammer. She mentioned the demand letter. She casually brought up the favor he owed her from the late 90s. Then, she made the offer. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum delivered with a smile. I couldn't hear his response, but I watched Clara nod slowly, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. 3 minutes later, she ended the call and placed her phone face down on the table. She looked at me and said it was done. Trenton had agreed to the buyout. He was emailing the assignment of debt paperwork to her secure server right now. I immediately initiated the wire transfer from my logistics company's operating account. I watched the progress bar on my iPad screen fill up, confirming that $88,800 had just left my control. I looked up at Clara, my heart pounding in my chest. She raised her espresso cup in a silent toast. She told me that as of 10 minutes from now, the wire would clear. Trenton Graves would get his money, and he would legally sign over Declan's promissory note to my corporation. I was no longer a bystander. I was now the sole legal holder of my brother's debt. I owned him. But owning the debt wasn't enough to get them off my boat and out of my life forever. I needed leverage. I needed a lock so tight they could never squirm their way out of it again. I told Clara we needed to draft the paperwork for my family to sign. We spent the next hour sitting in that dim booth, passing the iPad back and forth. We weren't drafting a standard repayment plan. We were drafting a legal bear trap. We created a dummy guarantor agreement. It was dense, packed with intimidating legal jargon, and designed to look like a standard corporate compliance form. But buried inside the text were specific, unchangeable clauses linking the debt directly to Harrison and Beatrice's personal assets. It was a masterpiece of legal destruction, and the best part was, I knew for an absolute fact that my arrogant father would never bother to read it. By the time I left Little Havana and drove back to the marina, the sun had fully set. The sky was pitch black, and the water in the harbor reflected the neon lights of the city like shattered glass. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 5 minutes, mentally preparing myself for the performance of a lifetime. I looked in the rearview mirror and began to dismantle the image of the successful CEO. I reached up and pulled several strands of hair loose from my immaculate bun, letting them fall messily around my face. I rubbed my eyes hard until they were slightly red and watery. I practiced my expression in the mirror. I needed to look utterly defeated. I needed to look small, compliant, and completely overwhelmed by the sheer pressure of family obligation. I had to become the beautiful, successful daughter who had finally been broken by the weight of her parents' demands. I grabbed the heavy manila folder containing the legal trap Clara and I had drafted, took a deep breath of the salty night air, and boarded the Sovereign. As I walked through the sliding glass doors into the main salon, I saw that they had made themselves completely at home. They were waiting for me like vultures perched on a fence. Declan had somehow found the courage to open a second bottle of my very expensive wine and was pouring himself a glass. Beatrice was comfortably lounging on the sofa, casually flipping through an exclusive yachting magazine, occasionally pointing out redecorating ideas she thought would look better in my living room. The moment I stepped inside, the room went quiet. Harrison was standing by the window. He turned around, barking at me like a drill sergeant. He demanded to know if the transfer was done and if the money was sent. I let my shoulders slump forward, clutching the manila folder to my chest like a shield. I kept my voice soft, letting a tiny, deliberate tremor slip into my words. I told him that I could do it. I said that I had spoken to the bank and authorized the release of the funds. I watched the wave of absolute triumph wash over their faces. Beatrice let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, muttering something about how family always comes through in the end. Declan smiled, looking like a man who had just won the lottery without buying a ticket. But before they could start celebrating their successful extortion, I held up a hand. I told them there was a complication. I said the money was ready to move, but there was a massive problem with the Internal Revenue Service. Harrison's triumphant smile instantly vanished. The letters IRS have a magical way of sobering up even the most arrogant men. He stepped away from the window, demanding to know what kind of problem. I walked slowly over to the wet bar. I knew that to sell a massive lie, you have to wrap it in a gesture of complete submission. I reached into the chilled cooler and pulled out a bottle of Dom Perignon. It was a celebratory bottle I had been saving for a major contract signing, but tonight, it was bait. I popped the cork, the loud hiss echoing in the quiet room. I poured 4 glasses, my hands shaking just enough to look convincing. I handed one to Harrison, one to Beatrice, and slid one across the table to Declan. They took the champagne, their eyes wary but inherently greedy. I knew their psychology inside and out. Alcohol and a groveling apology were the two things they could never, ever resist. I sat down on the edge of a chair, making myself look physically smaller than them, and prepared to spin the web. I took a tiny sip of my champagne, looking up at Harrison with wide, anxious eyes. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so I sounded like a co-conspirator sharing a dangerous secret. I told him that I desperately wanted to help. I said that I couldn't bear the thought of Declan going to prison or getting hurt by those awful people. I fed them exactly what they wanted to hear, that they were right, that family is family, and that my money was their money. Beatrice actually smiled at me, a sickeningly sweet expression, telling me that she knew I would eventually come to my senses. But then I dropped the anchor. I whispered that I couldn't just write a personal check or send a straight wire transfer for $148,000. I explained that an unexplained cash transfer of that size leaving a corporate account to pay off a private gambling debt would trigger an immediate, devastating federal audit. I told them my accountant would have a literal stroke, and the tax implications would destroy my company. I lied with absolute, practiced conviction. I said that the IRS would classify it as an unearned gift or corporate embezzlement, and I would instantly lose 40% of the money to penalty taxes before it even reached the lender. I watched Harrison's ears practically perk up. If there was one thing my father hated more than working for a living, it was paying taxes. He leaned forward over the coffee table, the champagne entirely forgotten in his hand. He asked me, his voice tight with sudden interest, what the plan was. He wanted to know how we were going to beat the system. I smiled inwardly, though my face remained a mask of worried compliance. I told him that my lawyers had figured out a loophole. I explained that we needed to structure the payment not as a gift, but as a formal corporate debt purchase. I lied so smoothly it honestly scared me. I told him that my logistics company would officially buy Declan's debt from the private lender. By doing that, the debt goes onto my company's financial books as a distressed asset acquisition. I watched Harrison's eyes widen as he processed the fake financial jargon. I told him that by classifying it as a distressed asset, it becomes a massive tax write-off for my corporation. I said that if we do it this way, I save about $40,000 in corporate taxes at the end of the year, and Declan gets off completely scot-free without the IRS ever looking twice at the transaction. I saw the exact moment the trap snapped shut in Harrison's mind. The shift in his eyes was incredible. He wasn't just getting a free bailout for his favorite son anymore. He was getting a deal. He was actively helping his CEO daughter cheat the federal government. That made him feel incredibly smart. It made him feel powerful, like he was the mastermind of a high-level corporate conspiracy. He puffed out his chest, looking at Declan and Beatrice with a knowing nod. Declan, however, looked nervously at the thick manila folder in my lap. He muttered that it sounded really complicated. I quickly assured him it was just standard bureaucratic paperwork to keep the government off our backs. I told them that to make the purchase look legitimate to the auditors, I needed a paper trail proving that the debt was real and that I had secured it against actual family assets. I opened the folder and pulled out the legal trap Clara had designed, laying it gently on the glass coffee table between us. The document sat on the table, thick and heavy with legal jargon. It was titled Secured Asset Guarantor Acknowledgement. I waved my hand over it dismissively, treating it like a pesky terms and conditions page on a software update. I told them it was just a dummy document. I promised that as soon as they signed it, I would file it away in a locked cabinet in my office, and it would never see the light of day. I reiterated that it was strictly a prop so I could show the IRS auditors that this transaction was a secured business investment and not an illegal family gift, which legally justified my massive tax break. Harrison didn't even glance at the paragraphs of dense text. He simply picked up the expensive silver pen resting on the table and twirled it in his fingers. He looked at me and asked for final confirmation. He asked if they signed this piece of paper, the debt would be gone, poof, vanished into thin air. I nodded enthusiastically. I told him yes, The moment the ink dried, I would authorize the funds to hit the lender's account. But then I paused, biting my lip as if I had just remembered a crucial, annoying detail. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my iPhone. I set it down on the table, propping it up against a crystal vase so the camera lens had a clear, wide angle of the sofa where all three of them were sitting. I sighed, acting deeply apologetic. I told them that my corporate board of directors had recently instituted a strict new compliance policy. I lied and said that for any non-standard asset transfer over $10,000, the legal department required a short video recording of the guarantors acknowledging the terms, just to prevent future lawsuits. I said that if I didn't attach a video file to the wire transfer request, the bank's automated system would freeze the transaction. Harrison looked at the phone, then at his champagne glass, and then at Declan. Greed is a powerful, blinding anesthetic. It completely numbs the survival instinct. He didn't see a camera recording his downfall. He saw a minor inconvenience standing between him and free money. He grunted, waving his hand impatiently, and told me to just turn the damn thing on and get it over with. I tapped the screen and pressed record. A small red dot appeared. I stepped back, staying out of the frame. I kept my voice perfectly even and professional. I asked them to state for the compliance record that the debt of $148,000 was incurred solely by Declan, and that they, as his guarantors, currently had no liquid assets or cash on hand to settle the obligation themselves. I reminded them that the auditors needed to hear that they were entirely insolvent, otherwise, the IRS would ask why the parents didn't just pay it. Harrison sat up straighter, clearing his throat. He looked directly into the lens of my iPhone with the arrogant confidence of a man who genuinely believes he is pulling off the heist of the century. He proudly stated his full name. He formally acknowledged the exact dollar amount of the debt. He stated clearly on camera that it belonged to his son, Declan. And then, he delivered the kill shot. He stated, loudly and clearly, that he and his wife were completely insolvent and did not have the cash to pay it. I smiled, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told him that was perfect. But then I threw out one last, casual piece of bait. I said that just to clear the air for the audit history, in case the IRS looked at past family financial transfers, we should probably mention the initial seed money. I casually brought up my grandmother's inheritance, saying we needed to show that family funds had been commingled before to establish a legal precedent for this transaction. It was a massive gamble. But Harrison was high on the prospect of solving his problems, and he was 2 glasses of champagne deep. He waved his hand at the camera, laughing. He freely admitted, on high-definition video, that they had used my $10,000 inheritance years ago to fund Declan's app, claiming it was all just one big family pot. He had just confessed to grand larceny, fraud, and total insolvency on camera, smiling the entire time. I slid the document across the table and pointed to the dotted lines. Without reading a single word, Harrison signed. Beatrice signed. Declan signed. The trap was locked. The second the silver pen lifted from the final signature line, the silence in the yacht's salon was broken by a soft, sharp chime. I glanced down at my left wrist. My Apple Watch screen illuminated in the dim light, displaying a secure notification from my corporate server. The wire transfer to Trenton Graves had cleared. The assignment of debt had been executed. The asset was officially acquired. I reached across the glass table and tapped the screen of my iPhone, ending the video recording. I picked up the phone, checked to make sure the file was safely saved to my cloud drive, and slipped it into my pocket. Then, I picked up the manila folder containing the freshly signed guarantor agreement. I closed it, the heavy thud of the cardboard sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. Harrison leaned back on the sofa, crossing his arms with a look of supreme satisfaction. He took a long sip of the champagne, savoring what he thought was the taste of total victory. He looked at me, an arrogant smirk plastered on his face, and asked if we were finally done here. He told me to authorize the wire to the lender so Declan could stop looking over his shoulder. I stood up slowly. I didn't slump my shoulders anymore. I didn't look down. I straightened my spine, pulling myself up to my full height. The air of the terrified, compliant daughter instantly evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating presence of the woman who had clawed her way up from the rust and grease of the shipyards. I looked at the three of them, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I told them that the money was already gone. The transaction was complete. Declan let out a loud cheer, jumping up from the sofa and actually trying to reach out and hug me. I stepped back, holding up my hand to stop him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I looked directly at my father and spoke very clearly, enunciating every single word so there could be no misunderstanding. I told him that the money was gone, but I did not pay off the debt. I bought it. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a bomb detonates. Harrison frowned, confusion momentarily overriding his arrogance. He asked me what the hell I was talking about. He reminded me of the plan, the tax write-off, the loophole. I opened the folder and pulled out the signed document. I didn't hand it to him, I held it up. I told him there was no tax loophole. I informed them that my corporation was now the sole legal owner of Declan's $148,000 debt. I then directed his attention to Section 4, Paragraph B of the contract they had just eagerly signed without reading. I explained the default clause. I told them that because they had just recorded a video legally acknowledging the debt, while simultaneously declaring on camera that they were completely insolvent and lacked the funds to pay it, the contract automatically triggered an immediate, irrevocable default. I watched the blood drain from Harrison's face as the reality of my words finally pierced through his ego. I kept going. I told them that because they signed as secured guarantors, the debt was legally attached to their primary residence. And, because they were in immediate default, the lien on their house was now active and fully enforceable. I looked at my parents, who had stolen my future to fund their favorite son, and delivered the final blow. I told them that the foreclosure process on their home was going live in the morning. The explosion of noise was deafening. Harrison leaped up from the sofa, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He screamed that I was a lying, manipulative psychopath. He lunged forward, raising his hand as if he were going to strike me or rip the contract from my grasp. Beatrice burst into hysterical tears, wailing that I was tearing the family apart over money. Declan was hyperventilating, backing away toward the door like a trapped animal, realizing that he hadn't escaped the fire. He had just been pushed into a much hotter one. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice to shout over them. I simply reached under the lip of the wet bar and pressed the small, discreet red button hidden beneath the counter. It was the silent panic alarm wired directly to the marina's security office and the local port authority. Harrison was still screaming, threatening to sue me, threatening to destroy my company, claiming the video was coerced. I just looked at him with absolute pity. I told him he couldn't afford a lawyer to fight a parking ticket, let alone a drawn-out corporate litigation battle against a company that essentially had unlimited legal resources courtesy of Aunt Clara. Within 90 seconds, the heavy footsteps of armed security personnel echoed on the teak deck outside. Two Port Authority officers stepped into the salon, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. They looked at the chaotic scene, the screaming parents, the crying brother. Then they looked at me. I stood perfectly still, holding the folder. I calmly informed the officers that I was the registered owner of this commercial vessel, and the three individuals screaming in my salon were unauthorized, hostile trespassers who were refusing to leave. Harrison tried to argue. He tried to play the role of the concerned father dealing with an ungrateful daughter. But the officers didn't care about family drama, they cared about maritime trespassing laws. They took Harrison by the arm. When he resisted, they forcefully escorted him out the glass doors. Beatrice followed, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her expensive purse. Declan practically ran off the boat, too terrified to even look me in the eye. I stood on the aft deck and watched as they were marched down the dock, their luggage trailing behind them, disappearing into the warm Miami night. 3 weeks later, Aunt Clara represented my company in court. It was a bloodbath. The judge granted a summary judgment in our favor within 20 minutes. The video confession was bulletproof. The lien stood. My parents' house was seized and sold at auction to cover the debt, the accrued interest, and Clara's exorbitant legal fees. As for Declan, the court issued a wage garnishment order. 15% of whatever meager paycheck he managed to earn would be automatically diverted to my corporate account for the next 10 years. On the day the judgment was finalized, Declan called me from a prepaid phone. He called me a monster. I didn't get angry. I just calmly replied that I wasn't a monster. I was his creditor. Then I hung up and permanently blocked the number. Later that evening, as the Sovereign pulled away from the dock, heading out into the open, quiet ocean, I poured myself a glass of scotch. I watched the city lights fade into the distance, finally feeling the absolute, unbreakable peace I had earned. They say you can't put a price on family. They were wrong. The price was exactly $148,000, and I had bought my freedom in full. So Reddit, after 3 years of being dead to them, I took everything they had and legally ruined them. Am I the jerk for acting like a ruthless CEO instead of a forgiving daughter, or should I have accepted their forced apology? Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button, like the video, and let me know your verdict in the comments below.